Well, thank you. We tried to prepare as good a program as we could, and I think we tried to get fascinating and great speakers who are going to share with you different aspects of what I want to touch a little bit before I call on Mr. Kurkjian. This mindset of where we come from, trying to put something together as tonight. Some people believe that public tributes to great figures should celebrate ideas and ideals rather than the person. I think there is something to be said for this point of view. After all, the individual is particular and necessarily complex, whereas the ideal is plain and universal. And for those interested in finding out where the great man's footsteps lead, even more significant. Yet in the case of Hrant Dink, it's hard to slight the man. He is one of those rare figures whose life and death are permanently and perfectly linked with his ideas and ideals. He lived as he preached, as a brother and a son and father to all humanity, without regard to what was written on anyone's identity card. And he died as he preached, on his feet, standing in front of the place where he struggled every day to make the footsteps so many of us have now come to cherish and revere. And yet it would be ironic, if not irresponsible, if we spent too much effort on celebrating the man and not enough on what he lived and died for. To lionize him won't, and without acknowledging him, what he stood for, and it would be an insult to the memory of this extraordinary human being and fighter. Hrant Dink rejected conventional wisdom. He hated the easy, instinctive answer. He sought to shake our beliefs, aimed above else to get us to ask questions. I can think of no better tribute to him today than to raise the kind of questions that I think he would want me and us to ask. Supposing he were here to advise us on how to view him and the world today, what would he have us ask? What easy, instinctive answer would he have us abandon? Does his death prove that he was wrong or that he was right? Did his death show that he misunderstood and underestimated the challenge, or that he understood it and fought it especially well? Finally, since no one can forgive crimes committed against other people, and that includes all of us who are alive here, what would Hrant do if his killer had asked for forgiveness and those behind? Would he be angry at this tragic event and atrocity to lose his compassion for the Turkish people? As I said, we've done our best to prepare a fitting tribute to Hrant Dink. Our first speaker is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Jefferson had said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them." I think Hrant would not hesitate either. Stephen Kurkjian, a journalist, recently retired from the Boston Globe after a career of more than 35 years at the paper, during which he won 3 Pulitzer Prizes and more than 20 other regional or national awards for his investigative reporting. The Globe's Washington bureau chief from 1986 to 1991, he had previously been a founder and head of Globe's Spotlight investigative team. He is a member of Nasser's board of directors and serves on its executive committee. In January 2007, he traveled to Istanbul to witness and cover the funeral of Hrant Dink and its aftermath. He presented his initial report in a Globe feature in a talk at Nasser in February 2007, following up with a lengthy article in the AGBU magazine in April, and has continued to follow the murder investigation and related developments in Turkey. So, I would love to call on Mr. Kurkjian.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Appreciate the introduction. Archbishop, esteemed members of the clergy, appreciate greatly the organizations that have invited me here tonight, and to know that I shared the stage just over a year ago, the same stage that Hrant also spoke to you at, makes the event that much more cherished. I felt an extraordinary, even though I had never met the man, I felt an extraordinary affinity to him during his talks and his work, for two reasons, of course. One is that he was an Armenian, and second, that he was a journalist. So I knew, as Nancy had said, when the bulletin came across my newsroom at the Globe, Boston Globe, that this Armenian journalist, this spokesperson for democracy and freedom of expression, had been assassinated, I knew very quickly that there was only one place for me personally. And by Sunday, I was on a plane going to Istanbul. I had been to Turkey once before. In the early 90s, my father, who was a survivor, and rarely spoke of the atrocities that had taken his father, his brother and sister, and for whatever miraculous reason, had brought him to the United States and Boston to raise a family. He wanted to go back, and I went back with him, and we found his village, and we found his homestead in the Taurus mountain range south of Erzurum, a small village called Kirkjian. And we spent a little time in Istanbul, and I could see there as we went to try to learn a little bit and relate a little bit to the Armenian community in Istanbul, even though there were 70,000 people, those who expressed themselves as Armenians, that they lived a very hidden life. Yet, one look at the front pages of the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the LA Times, throughout this country, throughout the world on Saturday morning, you knew that something extraordinary had happened, and someone very important, not only to our lives, but to the lives of all who cherish democracy and free speech. Something terrible had happened, but I think had been assassinated. And for those who didn't know, all they had to do was turn on television and see the pictures from the night before from CNN, where out of nowhere, thousands of people had emerged from the streets of Istanbul to flock to his office place. The blood was still evident on the ground outside his office, and that they were crying out in their tears and in their grief. We are all Hrant. We are all Armenian. Extraordinary. I thought to myself, I was there. I was there only 10 years ago. People didn't proclaim, celebrate, pronounce their Armenianness. Now here, thousands of people are coming out of nowhere to say they are Armenian. If not in actuality, in spirit, because of this man. So as you can understand why I said there's no place for me but to go. And when I covered the event for the Globe, I came back and spoke to a large group of people in Boston about Hrant and who he was, and tried to convey the importance and just the emotion of what had happened there in Istanbul, the turnout that night of his death, and then 4 days later at his funeral. I was speaking at another event, and a younger man, spoke to me and raised his hand, and he asked me a question, and the question struck me. And I still don't know if I have the right answer to it. But he said to me, I understand and I share the grief as an Armenian of this great man's passing. But he was also a father, and he was also a grandfather. His son Hrant, he had just had their baby. It was his first grandchild. How can you correlate. How can you compare the loss of his position, of his importance of his position as a grandfather and a father, by his importance to society, his importance to us as Armenians, his importance to Democrats and people who are ardent for freedom of speech throughout the world, and mostly for the Turks, both Armenians and native Turks. How can you weigh them and say which way he should have gone? And it struck me, I didn't know enough about the man to answer the question. I didn't know enough about Hrant to answer that question. So I said I had to go back to Istanbul and learn more about him. I learned some fascinating things about the man, and mostly because of the openness that his family gave to me. I called his brother on the phone in Dalal, his daughter. Orhan does not speak English, and I don't speak Armenian or Turkish, but Dalal speaks fluent English. And she took the phone and she invited me that night. Second night I was in Turkey to come to the house, and she said, Orhan, my uncle will be here, and he'll tell you about his brother, my father. And I said, fine. I made my way to their apartment, top floor of an apartment building in Istanbul, neighborhood of Istanbul. I entered the room, and there was 15 members of the family there waiting. A big table full of food waiting. And his two daughters, his son, his brother, his wife, and his granddaughter. And they're waiting to talk to me about their beloved Hrant. And we talked, and Dalal translated everything to me about what this man meant to him as a family man. And so I asked him the question. I said, the reason I came back was to ask you this question, was to get this question answered. And they said, there is no answer to that question. He asked us many times during those final months, because the threats had continued and gotten worse, what he should do. And they said, Raquel, his wife, said to him, whatever you decide to do, we will follow. And as you probably know, in his last column that he wrote for Argos, he said, I will wait for the judgment of an international court to hear this case that I have been accused of and that I have been sentenced to in prison, a suspended sentence, but I have been going to be in prison on the sentence. I'll wait for an international court to hear it. And if they decide, this court decides that I should leave, yes, then I will leave, but not until then. Because I feel like I'm a pigeon or a dove here. And in the city, there are doves everywhere, and they seem to coexist with the people all around them. Well, my head is going around, twisting around, looking all around me like a dove. But I'm coexisting here, so I will stay here. And that column was published after he was killed. Before I talk a little bit more about him, I want to talk to you a little bit about what the past year has brought in Turkey to the promises that were made about changes that would come because of this man's death. Many top members of the government, Turkish government, attended his funeral, as you know, and then Prime Minister Erdogan, and now President Erdogan, visited Hrant's home shortly after his death, and he offered his condolences to Raquel and the children. He said to them, Hrant's death will not be in vain. We will catch those responsible, and we will make sure that the differences between the Turks and the Armenians, the people, will be bridged. Last March, when I went back, I visited with U.S. Ambassador Ross Wilson in his embassy in Ankara. And he also was hopeful about how the Turkish government would proceed. following Hrant's death. He told me, many of us have encouraged the Turkish government that in this tragedy there are opportunities in how they handle this investigation and how they handle the issues connected with Hrant Dink and his life and what it stood for, and how they handle their dealings with the Armenian government and the diaspora can really help them, the Turkish government, promote the kind of Turkey that continues it on the trajectory that they've been seeking as a democracy. What hopeful words they were. The follow-through, unfortunately, has fallen short. In the two major areas, investigating the assassination and defanging Article 301, the criminal code that in effect targeted Hrant Dink for assassination, the Turkish government has not met expectations. I waited outside the Patriarchate in Istanbul as then Prime Minister Erdogan gave his pledge to us, the Archbishop, to change that Article 301 so it would not demonize people like it had Hrant. The law has been altered to a degree. Now only the government can bring charges, not an average citizen. But it still remains in effect, and it will. And for those who read the article, the account of the change that was in the New York Times this morning, you will note that more cases using Article 301 have been brought in 2007, 11 months in the aftermath of Hrant Dink's death, than had been in 2006. And the law, in fact, has been used to prosecute Hrant's son, his only son, Hrant Dink, who is now co-executive editor of Argos and a second senior editor. Their crime, as was Hrant's, was acknowledging in print what modern Turkish government has denied since coming to power, that what happened in 1915 was a genocide. As you may have heard, 28-year-old Hrant has received numerous threats to his life and safety, Hrant's son. And there have even been reports that he has fled to Belgium in fear of his life. Think of the tragedy of that situation. Here, this young man's father was assassinated because of his advocating for Armenian causes. And less than a year later, his son must leave his birthplace. Thankfully, in an interview earlier this month, Hrant denied that he had abandoned Turkey. Yes, he had private business to attend in Belgium. He acknowledged some had urged him that after his conviction on Article 301, that he should leave for his safety's sake. But this is what he said in the interview. I could be the last young person to wish to leave this country because I have a big example in front of me. And that big example preferred to stay in spite of his difficulties. That example inspires me more than it does other people. He's an extraordinary credit to his parents, to his siblings, and to Armenians everywhere. The second challenge that Turkey said it would be judged on was conducting a vigorous investigation into Hrant's assassination. Charges have been brought against 3 principals and probably 24 associates. In September, those 3 principals, Erhan Tunsal, Yasin Hayal, had begun to conspire in January 2006, even before Hrant was here in Field, to find a 3rd person who would actually carry out the attack. In September, they found Ogun Samast, and he agreed, the 17-year-old, to be the gunman. According to the indictment, the 3 felt threatened by Dink's statement on behalf of minority rights and recognition of the genocide. The indictment, which I had translated for an article I did for 2 newspapers, Boston Armenian newspapers, said that Hayal told Samast, be careful. He is the Ataturk of the Armenian people. The indictment says that Hayal found Samast while he was playing soccer Trabzon. No mention is made in the indictment of what local newspapers there reported at the time of their arrest. That the three all had ties to the Grand Union Party, the ultra-nationalist party there. To refuse to recognize the role that politics played in Dink's killing is to hide one's head in the sand. I remind you of what happened in this country with the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. Go see the movie again, Mississippi Burning. The killings of civil rights advocates in this country would not have happened had it not been for the tolerance, the encouragement, and the forgiveness of those in city halls throughout the South, those in the sheriff's office throughout the South, and those in state houses throughout the South. Hatred towards blacks was encouraged, tolerated, and forgiven. Now, there's no evidence that the government ordered Hrant's death, but so many of those in the Turkish intelligentsia believe a right-wing conspiracy among military superior officers, police intelligence, and extreme nationalists played a role, and they've given that group a name. It's called the Deep State. This week, there were arrests of 30 people in Istanbul and an Istanbul suburb. The Turkish police took in possession a cache of explosives. They accused members of this group of being terrorists. Among the 30 was the lawyer for Yasin Hayal, who was considered the prime motivator in Dink's killing, as well as a retired Turkish army officer and a right-wing lawyer who has brought 301 prosecutions against Hrant Dink and Orhan Pamuk. The prosecutions of Dink under Article 301 provided the spark that led to the fire that burned towards him. For 2 years, the prosecution of him under Article 301 in effect put a target on his back. And when Prime Minister went to his house to convey his condolences to Raquel, she asked only one favor for everyone. Do not allow the Justice Minister, the one who had accused Dink 2 years before at the beginning of the prosecution under 301, of accusing Dink of stabbing the country in the back. She asked that he not be allowed to come into her home. That Justice Minister was in charge of the investigation into Hrant Dink's assassination. Rifat Bali, a Turkish historian of Jewish descent, put his finger on it when I interviewed him in Istanbul and said, where Turkey is different from other Western countries is the belief that is accepted here by so many people, that they are upholding national ideals by expressing hatred with violence. Bali was a friend and a supporter of Hrant Dink, but he also thought he was naive in underestimating the resentment that this underclass, this ultranationalist sentiment, rivets through the Turkish society. And when Hrant Dink, in his last column, said, I will leave only when an international court finds me guilty, what he was saying was it's an insult to me as a Turkish citizen to accuse me of being blasphemous for insulting my neighbors. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it, and I couldn't do it. All my life I have struggled against ethnic discrimination and racism. I would never belittle Turkishness or Armenianness. What an extraordinary man, and my pride in him as an Armenian and a journalist is unbounded. When I returned to Istanbul, I found that he had asked his wife 2 nights before his death, find in the Bible what am I supposed to do? Friends like Tana had urged him to leave. Let the Bible tell me what I'm supposed to do. His wife did not get to the minister in time to get the word back to her. But I asked his minister when I visited him, what does the Bible say? What would the minister, what would you have told him if he had come to you? And he said, I would have told what the Bible does say to all believers. You must believe in God, and you must help your fellow man believe in God. That is our responsibility. That is our mission in life. So it seemed to me that by giving up his life for the things he believed in, and by looking into the Bible for his answer, he answered that question that I had been asked, and that we each ask ourselves. For what would you give up your life? And Haram did give up his life for the greatest of reasons. Because he believed in us. So many of you know what it is like to be an Armenian in Istanbul. And I learned when I went there the first time in 1992 what makes Armenians different there. It was in a village outside of Istanbul, and my guide showed me, brought me to a house, and he said, this is a house where Armenians lived. And I said to him, Armin, Armin Arroyo, some of you may know him, he's from here. I said, Armin, how can you tell it's an Armenian house? And he said, well, it's the windows, Steve. I said, what? He says, it's the wide windows. Armenians here in the old days were unlike their Turkish neighbors. Turks did not want wide windows. They didn't want anybody looking in. But the Armenians didn't feel that sense of caution. And then it struck me then, right at that moment, that it was such a perfect symbol of who we are as a people. We're the people with the big windows because we open up the windows to embrace life, to embrace the world. And that, to me, is the ultimate symbol of who Haram Think was. He was not afraid of the world. He challenged it. He was not afraid of even his opponents. He was willing to beat them on any level playing field, to engage them, to get to know them, to respect them, and to hope to appreciate each other's thoughts. He was a great man. We are lesser for his loss, but we have been made great by his readings, his teachings, and may those words stay with us for this anniversary and for countless anniversaries to come. Thank you very much.